The rain had been falling for 3 days when Robert Bruce stood on the wet stones of the Torwood and understood that everything he had fought for across 8 years of war would be decided within sight of Stirling Castle, and the certainty of this knowledge settled into his bones like the damp that never left the Scottish summer, even in late June. He was 40 years old in that summer of 1314, his face scarred from a lifetime of combat that had begun when he was little more than a boy learning the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare in his father's retinue, and the leprosy that would eventually kill him was already whispering its presence in the numbness that occasionally crept across his left hand, though he told no one of this and wrapped his fingers around his sword hilt each morning to test whether the strength remained. The army gathering around him in the ancient oak forest was perhaps the largest Scotland had fielded since William Wallace's catastrophic defeat at Falkirk 16 years earlier, though calling it an army required a generous interpretation of the term, for these were not the mailed knights and professional men-at-arms of Edward II's approaching host, but rather the common men of a poor kingdom, farmers who had left their fields during the brief window between spring planting and summer harvest, younger sons of minor nobility who could afford a helmet and a spear but not the warhorse and a full plate that marked a true knight of chivalry, Highland clansmen who fought in the old way with axes and long dirks and spoke Gaelic in dialects that the lowland Scots could barely comprehend. Bruce had approximately 6,000 men, though the chroniclers would later inflate this number, or reduce it depending on whether they wished to magnify the English humiliation or diminish the Scottish achievement, and of these perhaps 500 could be called knights or mounted men-at-arms, while the rest were spearmen organised into the densely packed formations called schiltrons that Wallace had pioneered as the only infantry tactic capable of withstanding a cavalry charge if the men held their nerve and kept their hedge of spear points unbroken. Edward of Caernarfon, second of that name to rule England, had crossed the border at the head of an army that contemporary accounts numbered anywhere from 15,000 to 25,000 men, though the most reliable estimates suggest approximately 20,000 when one counted the armoured cavalry, the Welsh longbowmen, the Irish auxiliaries, the Gascon crossbowmen, and the vast baggage train of supply wagons that stretched for miles along the Roman roads leading north into Scotland. Edward was 29 years old and had inherited his father's throne 6 years earlier, along with an unfinished war that the first Edward, Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, had prosecuted with such systematic brutality that he had very nearly succeeded in extinguishing Scottish independence entirely before death claimed him while marching north for yet another campaign. The second Edward lacked his father's military genius and his pathological focus, being a man of mercurial enthusiasms who preferred the company of his favourites to the counsel of his earls, and who had already sparked one near rebellion among his nobility through his infatuation with Piers Gaveston, the Gascon knight whom he had elevated beyond all reason until the outraged barons had seized Gaveston and beheaded him on Blacklow Hill 2 years earlier. The Scottish campaign of 1314 was meant to restore Edward's prestige among an aristocracy that questioned his competence and his manhood in the particular way that medieval nobility used those terms, conflating military prowess with sexual orthodoxy and political authority with the ability to personally kill one's enemies in face-to-face combat. And so Edward had assembled the largest English army to enter Scotland in years, with the explicit intention of relieving Stirling Castle, whose English garrison had agreed to surrender to the Scots if not relieved by Midsummer's Day, the 24th of June. The castle itself sat atop its great volcanic crag like a stone crown, visible for miles across the flat castland where the River Forth coiled through its marshy plain, and whoever held Stirling held the key to the north of Scotland, for here the Highlands met the Lowlands, and all the ancient roads converged at the lowest crossing point of the Forth before it widened into its tidal estuary. Bruce had spent the spring digging pits along the road that led from the southeast toward the castle, narrow holes each as deep as a man's knee, concealed with woven branches and scattered earth, designed to break the legs of war horses and turn an ordered cavalry charge into screaming chaos. And he had positioned his schiltrons on the hard ground just south of the Bannockburn, the small stream that gave the coming battle its name, choosing terrain that restricted the English ability to deploy their superior numbers and forced them to attack uphill across ground broken by rabbit warrens and hidden wet patches where the peat held water like a sponge. Medieval warfare was a matter of logistics as much as valour, And Bruce understood that Edward's great army required enormous quantities of food for men and fodder, for perhaps 3,000 war horses, that the supply train could only move as fast as the slowest ox cart, that an army of 20,000 men consumed a district's food supplies in days and left famine behind it like a plague, and that Edward was operating at the end of a long supply line while Bruce's men fought within a day's march of their own lands and could, if necessary, disperse into the hills and wage the guerrilla war that had characterised much of the previous 8 years. On the 23rd of June, the English vanguard made contact with the Scottish position in a series of skirmishes that later chroniclers would describe as the first day of Bannockburn, though Bruce had not yet committed to a pitched battle and may have been planning to withdraw if the English deployment proved too overwhelming to contest. A force of English cavalry under the Earls of Gloucester and Hereford attempted to reach the castle by the direct road and encountered Bruce himself at the head of a small company, inspecting his prepared ground. And what happened next passed immediately into legend because it violated every convention of how a king should conduct himself in the presence of enemy knights. Henry de Bohun, nephew to the Earl of Hereford and a young knight eager for the renown that came from striking down an enemy of high rank, recognised Bruce by the crown circlet he wore on his helmet and spurred his warhorse into a charge, couching his lance in the approved fashion, bearing down on the Scottish king with all the momentum that 1,200 pounds of armoured horse could generate. And Bruce, who was mounted on a small grey palfrey rather than a warhorse, waited until the last moment, and then swerved aside with the instinct of a man who had survived 100 such encounters. And as de Bohun thundered past, Bruce stood in his stirrups and brought his battle-axe down on the English knight's head with such force that the axe blade clove through helmet and skull and brain, and killed de Bohun instantly, though the axe handle shattered from the impact, and Bruce's commanders berated him afterward for risking the entire Scottish cause on a moment of personal combat, when his death would have ended the war and delivered Scotland to English rule. That night the Scottish camp burned with a fierce joy because their king had proven himself in single combat, according to the old heroic code that still held imaginative power, even as warfare evolved into something more systematic and less personal, while in the English camp the mood darkened because the initial skirmishing had revealed that the Scots would not simply flee at the approach of the king's army as Edward had apparently expected. The ground between the armies was not an open plain, but rather a landscape of complex terrain that would channel and constrain the battle in ways that favoured the defender, and Bruce had studied this ground for weeks, walking it in different lights, probing the wet patches with his spear, measuring sight lines and calculating where the morning sun would blind an attacker advancing from the southeast. The Bannockburn itself was fordable at several points, but its banks were steep in places, and the ground on the English side was lower and wetter, while the new park, the royal hunting forest that lay to the northwest of the burn, provided both cover and firm ground where the schiltrons could form in disciplined ranks. Medieval battles were rare events because a commander who accepted battle risked everything on a single afternoon's fighting, and the conventions of the time allowed a defeated army's nobility to be ransomed but condemned the common soldiers to slaughter. So the psychological pressure on Bruce as he made his final decision to stand and fight rather than withdraw must have been nearly unbearable, because defeat would mean not just his own death but the death of the independence movement, and quite probably the deaths of most of the men who had followed him through 8 years of brutal, grinding warfare that had already consumed much of Scottish manhood and left whole districts depopulated. The English army spent the night of the 23rd in increasingly cramped conditions as more units arrived, and attempted to find space to bivouac in the narrow ground between the burn and the higher land to the north, and the confusion was compounded by Edward's decision to push forward toward the castle rather than waiting for a daylight and better reconnaissance of the Scottish position, a decision that seems to have been driven more by impatience and political pressure than by sound military judgment. By dawn on the 24th Midsummer's Day, the English found themselves compressed into a space perhaps 2,000 yards wide and 1,000 yards deep, bounded on the left by the Bannockburn and on the right by the even larger obstacle of the Forth itself, which at this point was already tidal and impassable, and behind them the ground sloped down toward the castleland, the boggy floodplain where the Forth meandered through its loops and oxbows. This was exactly the kind of restricted terrain that negated the English advantages in cavalry numbers, because a cavalry charge required space to build momentum and room to manoeuvre, to envelop the enemy flanks and strike from multiple directions. But here, the English were trapped in a killing ground where they could only attack frontally against prepared positions, and the professional soldiers among Edward's commanders must have understood this immediately when the dawn light revealed their tactical situation. But the political dynamics of a medieval royal army made it nearly impossible to retreat without fighting, because withdrawal in the face of an inferior enemy would be interpreted as cowardice and would destroy what remained of Edward's credibility with his nobility. Bruce addressed his army in the grey light before full dawn, moving among the schildrons on foot so the men could see him clearly, and the speeches that chroniclers later attributed to him probably bear little resemblance to what he actually said. But the substance was certainly a reminder that they fought for their land and their freedom, while the English fought for a king's pride and a vassal's obligation, that the Scots had chosen this ground and prepared it, while the English were cramped and disordered, that Scottish spears had broken English cavalry before at Stirling Bridge, where Wallace had won his great victory 17 years earlier, and most importantly, that there would be no retreat because behind them lay everything they fought to protect, and before them lay an enemy that if victorious would burn their homes and enslave their families according to the brutal conventions of medieval warfare against rebels. The schildrons were formed in 4 main divisions, 3 in the front line under Bruce's most trusted commanders. His brother Edward Bruce on the right, Thomas Randolph Earl of Moray in the centre, and James Douglas on the left, with Bruce himself commanding the reserve, and each schildron contained perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 men, packed shoulder to shoulder in a circular or rectangular formation, bristling with 12-foot spears held at angles that created an almost impenetrable hedge of sharpened steel points. And the men in these formations were not the feudal levies that might break and run at the first cavalry charge, but rather veterans of years of warfare who had learned to trust the formation and trust each other, because their survival depended absolutely on every man holding his position, no matter how terrifying it was to stand still while armoured knights on massive war horses thundered toward them at speeds that seemed impossible to withstand. The English attack began in a confusion that characterised much of the battle, because there was no single coordinated assault, but rather a series of cavalry charges launched by different commanders at different times against different parts of the Scottish line, and this piecemeal approach meant that the English never brought their full weight to bear at a decisive point, but instead fed their cavalry into the battle in waves that the schildrons could deal with sequentially rather than simultaneously. The first major charge came from the Earls in Edward's vanguard, perhaps 500 knights and men-at-arms in full plate armour riding war horses that had been trained to bite and kick and crash into enemy formations, and the sound of this charge built from a rumble to a thunder that seemed to shake the earth as thousands of iron-shod hooves struck the ground, in a rhythm that was almost musical in its violence, and the Scottish spearmen watched this wall of horse and steel and bright painted shields, bearing the heraldry of England's greatest families, and every instinct of survival screamed at them to break and run because no man standing on foot could possibly withstand such force. But the veterans in the front ranks knew that running meant death, while standing together meant survival, and they braced their spears and locked their shoulders against the men behind them and prepared to receive the impact. What happened in the next seconds was the central tactical reality of the Battle of Bannockburn, and the reason that a smaller infantry force was able to defeat a larger cavalry army. Because war horses, no matter how well trained, will not impale themselves on a wall of spear points, but will instead shy away at the last moment or rear up in panic, and when a cavalry charge stops moving it ceases to be an effective weapon, and becomes instead a confused mass of vulnerable targets, and the Scottish spearmen thrust their weapons into the horses' chests and bellies and faces, while the riders, sitting high in their saddles, found themselves unable to bring their weapons to bear against enemies who stood behind a forest of spear points below the effective arc of a sword or mace. Knights who were unhorsed in the crush discovered that their expensive plate armour, which protected them beautifully in mounted combat against other knights, became a deadly liability when fighting on foot against nimble spearmen, who could dance around them and find the gaps in the armour at armpit and groin and throat, and the weight of the armour meant that a knight who fell had great difficulty rising again, especially on wet ground churned to mud by thousands of hooves, and so men who represented years of training and enormous financial investment drowned in puddles or were dragged down and stabbed through the visor slits of their helmets by Scottish knifemen who followed behind the schiltrons specifically to finish the wounded. The battle developed into a grinding slaughter that bore little resemblance to the romantic visions of knightly combat celebrated in the chivalric literature of the period, which described warfare as a series of individual duels between noble warriors fighting according to recognised codes of honour, when in reality Bannockburn was a confused melee in which men killed each other with agricultural implements in knee-deep mud, and the screaming of wounded horses created a soundtrack of animal agony that witnesses remembered decades later. The English cavalry made charge after charge against the schiltrons, each time expecting that sheer weight and courage would break the Scottish formation, because the military doctrine of the period held that properly armed and armoured knights on war horses were virtually invincible against infantry, and this doctrine had been proven in countless battles across Christendom. But the doctrine assumed open ground and disordered infantry, not prepared positions defended by disciplined spearmen on terrain that prevented the cavalry from manoeuvring or even deploying effectively. Between charges, individual Scottish units began to advance, pushing forward while maintaining their formation, and this aggressive movement put psychological pressure on the English cavalry, who were supposed to be attacking, but found themselves instead giving ground before infantry, which violated every assumption of social hierarchy and military propriety that governed medieval warfare. Edward's commanders belatedly attempted to deploy their archers, the Welsh longbowmen who had been decisive in English victories from Falkirk to Crecy, men who could loose 12 arrows per minute at effective ranges of 200 yards, and whose bodkin-pointed shafts could penetrate mail armour and sometimes even plate, but the archers required clear lines of sight and space to shoot without hitting their own cavalry, and the confused press of the battle meant that English knights were intermingled with Scottish spearmen in a way that made archery as dangerous to friends as to enemies. When the archers did finally deploy on the English left flank and begin to shower arrows into the Scottish formations with devastating effect, Bruce committed his only significant cavalry force, perhaps 500 light horsemen under the command of Robert Keith the Mareschal, who swept around the Scottish left and crashed into the archers before they could form defensive positions, and archers without protection were helpless against cavalry, their weapons useless at close range, their lack of armour making them easy targets, and Keith's horsemen cut through them in minutes and scattered the survivors, eliminating the one English tactical advantage that might have changed the battle's outcome. The fighting continued through the morning with a mechanical brutality, as both sides fed more men into the killing ground, and the Scottish schiltrons maintained their cohesion, while the English formations became increasingly disordered, and gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the English began to give way, not in a panicked rout but in a sullen backward movement, as exhausted men who had been fighting for hours in heavy armour under the June sun realised that they were not winning and might in fact be losing. The moment when a medieval army transitioned from coherent fighting force to mob of fleeing individuals was the most dangerous and consequential moment of any battle, because casualties in the actual fighting were often relatively light compared to the slaughter that occurred once one side broke and ran, when cavalry could ride down fleeing infantry, and the conventions that protected noble prisoners evaporated in the blood heat of pursuit. And at Bannockburn this moment came sometime in the early afternoon when the Scottish reserve under Bruce himself advanced into the battle, and the sight of fresh troops convinced the already wavering English that the day was lost. What followed was catastrophe on a scale that shocked even a medieval world accustomed to battlefield carnage, because the English army's position with its back to the Bannockburn and the Forth meant that there was no clear line of retreat, and as units began to disintegrate, men fled in all directions seeking any escape from the Scottish spears, and many ran toward the burn whose banks in places were steep enough that men and horses tumbled down in a mass of thrashing limbs and breaking bones, and the burn itself, normally a fordable stream, became choked with bodies as men in full armour attempted to cross and drowned in water that was scarcely waist-deep on a man unburdened by 60 pounds of steel plate, and others ran onto the castland where the ground that looked solid from a distance revealed itself to be treacherous bog that swallowed men whole or held them fast, while the pursuing Scots caught up and killed them. The chronicler who wrote that one could cross the Bannock burn dry shod on the bodies of the dead may have been engaging in rhetorical exaggeration, but the archaeological evidence suggests massive casualties concentrated in a small area, and estimates of English dead range from 4,000 to 11,000, depending on whether one trusts the Scottish sources that sought to magnify the victory or the English sources that sought to minimise the disaster. But even the most conservative estimates acknowledge that Edward lost a substantial portion of his army, including much of the aristocratic leadership, with the Earl of Gloucester dead on the field, along with dozens of other lords and knights whose deaths represented not just military losses, but political and financial catastrophes for their families. Edward himself escaped the battlefield in a flight that contemporaries considered shameful, galloping towards Stirling Castle with a bodyguard of knights, and then, when the castle's commander advised him that the fortress would have to surrender, under the terms previously agreed and therefore could not shelter the king, riding south in a desperate flight that took him through the Torwood, where Scottish scouts hunted him and nearly captured him before he finally reached the comparative safety of Dunbar Castle on the coast, and from there took ship back to England, arriving home without his army, without his baggage train, and without the military reputation that the campaign was supposed to restore. The supplies and equipment abandoned on the field at Bannockburn represented an enormous windfall for the impoverished Scots, who captured not just armour and weapons, but also the English war treasury, including perhaps £200,000 in silver coin that Edward had brought to pay his troops and to ransom the castle, and this sudden influx of wealth allowed Bruce to continue the war and to expand his raids into northern England, where Scottish armies would burn and pillage for the next 14 years, until Edward's government finally acknowledged Scottish independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Bruce's position in Scotland transform from that of a contested rebel leader to an unquestioned king, because Bannockburn was proof to wavering Scots that independence was possible and that English military superiority was not the inevitable fact of nature it had seemed after Longshank's campaigns, and the Scottish lords who had remained neutral or collaborated with the English occupation now hastened to make their peace with Bruce, or fled to England as permanent exiles, forfeiting their Scottish lands which Bruce redistributed to his supporters in a wholesale reorganisation of Scottish landholding that created a new aristocracy whose loyalty was based on recent service rather than ancient bloodlines. The battle also had profound consequences for Edward's reign in England, because the defeat vindicated his critics among the nobility who had argued that he was incompetent to rule, and the barons who had reluctantly joined the Scottish campaign returned home convinced that Edward lacked the military and political skills that medieval kingship required, and within a decade this loss of confidence would contribute to Edward's deposition and murder, the first time an English king had been forcibly removed from his throne since the Norman conquest. A political earthquake that demonstrated how completely Bannockburn had shattered the prestige that Edward needed to govern effectively. The military lessons of Bannockburn were studied and misunderstood in equal measure by subsequent commanders, because the battle seemed to prove that infantry could defeat cavalry if properly deployed and disciplined, but most observers failed to appreciate the specific circumstances that made the Scottish victory possible: the restricted terrain, the prepared ground, the exceptional cohesion of veteran troops fighting for existential stakes. And when later armies tried to replicate the Schiltron tactics on different terrain, against more skillful opponents, they often discovered that what worked at Bannockburn was not a universal formula, but rather a tactic suited to particular conditions. The Swiss would develop similar infantry tactics in their wars against the Habsburgs, creating pike formations that dominated European battlefields for 2 centuries. But even the Swiss suffered catastrophic defeats when they abandoned the defensive advantages that infantry enjoyed and tried to attack prepared positions or operate on open ground where cavalry could maneuver freely. And the lesson that Bannockburn actually taught, that combined arms tactics and terrain analysis were more important than any single troop type, was one that military theorists would have to relearn repeatedly across the following centuries. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond the immediate casualties, because medieval warfare killed not just soldiers, but also destabilised the social and economic structures that depended on those soldiers. And when the Earl of Gloucester died at Bannockburn, he left an inheritance dispute that tied up his estates for years and left hundreds of dependents without a secure patron. And similarly, the deaths of dozens of knights and lords created a crisis of succession across the English aristocracy that affected land tenure, marriage alliances, feudal obligations, and local governance in ways that rippled through society for decades. The horses killed at Bannockburn represented an equally serious loss because a trained warhorse required years to raise and cost as much as a village produced in annual rents, and the sudden destruction of perhaps 2,000 such animals in a single afternoon was an economic disaster that weakened England's military capacity for years afterward, and the chroniclers who described the field after the battle noted particularly the heaps of dead horses whose bodies had to be burned or buried to prevent pestilence, and the smell of burning horseflesh hung over the valley of the Bannockburn for weeks until summer rains finally dispersed it. The Scottish casualties were significant despite the one-sided nature of the final slaughter, because the Schiltron formations suffered heavily during the initial cavalry charges when English lances found gaps in the wall of spears, and when dismounted knights managed to force their way into the formations and laid about them with sword and mace, and the Scottish losses were concentrated among the experienced veterans who stood in the front ranks and absorbed the initial impact of each charge, men whose military skill and tactical knowledge were difficult to replace, and whose deaths represented a permanent loss to Scotland's limited military capacity. But the Scottish casualty rate was far lower than the English, perhaps 500 to 800 dead compared to the thousands who died fleeing the field, or drowning in the burn, or cut down in the pursuit that continued until nightfall and left bodies scattered across miles of countryside. The night after the battle, the Scottish camp celebrated with the fierce joy of men who had survived what they expected to be a death sentence, and the chroniclers record that Bruce moved among the wounded, both Scottish and English, and arranged for the English nobles to be treated and held for ransom according to the conventions of chivalric warfare, though the common English soldiers received no such consideration, and were either enslaved or allowed to limp south as living evidence of the disaster. Broken men who would spread the news of Bannockburn across northern England and undermine English morale for future campaigns. The political consequences of the battle extended beyond Scotland and England to affect the wider diplomatic landscape of early 14th century Europe, because Bannockburn occurred at a moment when the papacy was attempting to broker peace between France and England in preparation for a new crusade, and the Scottish question was entangled in this larger diplomatic effort because the Pope had excommunicated Bruce for the murder of John Comyn in a church 8 years earlier, a sacrilegious act that technically placed Bruce outside the Christian community and made it a pious duty to oppose him. But Bannockburn made it clear that Bruce could not be removed by English military force, and the Pope's representatives found themselves in the awkward position of trying to negotiate with a de facto king who was technically an excommunicated murderer and rebel. And this diplomatic impasse would continue for years until finally the papacy tacitly accepted Bruce's position and lifted the excommunication in exchange for Bruce's promise to go on crusade, a promise he never fulfilled because the leprosy that had been advancing slowly through his body finally killed him in 1329, the year after he finally achieved international recognition of Scottish independence. The battle's mythology began to take shape almost immediately after the fighting ended. The survivors told and retold their stories, emphasizing their own courage and the desperate nature of the combat, and within a generation Bannockburn had become the foundation myth of Scottish independence, the moment when Scotland defeated the old enemy against overwhelming odds and proved that a small nation fighting for its freedom could prevail against imperial aggression. And this mythological version of the battle emphasized divine providence, favoring the righteous cause, and minimize the crucial tactical and strategic decisions that actually determined the outcome, because medieval culture understood history primarily in moral and providential terms, rather than in the analytical framework of cause and effect that modern military history employs. Bards and chroniclers shaped the story of Bannockburn into a narrative of heroic resistance that served the political needs of the Bruce dynasty and its successors, and in this process many of the complex details were simplified or omitted. The English were transformed from a medieval army with its own internal divisions and tactical problems into a monolithic threat of overwhelming power. The Scots became uniformly heroic and united, when in fact Bruce's army included many men who had fought for the English in earlier phases of the war, and who joined Bruce only when it became clear he would win, and the battle itself was remembered as a single day of concentrated fighting, when in fact it extended over 2 days and included numerous preliminary skirmishes and a night of confusion when neither side was entirely sure what would happen at dawn. The landscape where the battle occurred began to accumulate layers of memory and meaning that transformed it from a piece of ordinary Scottish countryside into sacred ground, and in subsequent centuries visitors would seek out the sites associated with particular incidents. The place where Bruce killed de Bohun, the Bore Stone where Bruce allegedly planted his standard, the Bannockburn itself where so many English drowned. And these sites became pilgrimage destinations for Scottish patriots and tourists, seeking connection to a moment when their nation's existence hung in the balance and was preserved through courage and tactical brilliance. Though the actual location of the various phases of the battle remained controversial among historians, because medieval accounts rarely provided the kind of precise geographical detail that would allow definitive reconstruction of troop movements, and archaeological investigation has been complicated by centuries of agriculture and development that have erased or obscured much of the physical evidence. The long-term strategic consequences of Bannockburn extended well beyond the immediate military situation in Scotland, because the battle demonstrated to European observers that English arms were not invincible, and that the Plantagenet king's claims to overlordship of Britain were contested and potentially reversible, and this knowledge influenced French strategic calculations during the 100 Years' War, when France would ally with Scotland in a mutual defence pact that forced England to fight on two fronts and prevented English kings from concentrating their full military resources on their French campaigns. And thus Bannockburn had indirect effects on conflicts that would not occur for decades after the battle itself. The experience of the common soldiers who fought at Bannockburn was largely unrecorded by contemporary chroniclers who focused on the deeds of kings and nobles, but occasional fragments of evidence suggest the texture of their experience, the fear and exhaustion of standing in the schiltron while cavalry charged again and again, the physical shock transmitted through the spear shaft when the point struck armour or flesh, the strange intimacy of killing at close range where you could see your enemy's eyes and hear his breathing and smell his sweat, the aftermath of battle when wounded men screamed for water or mercy, and when the living moved among the heaps of dead stripping armour and weapons and valuables in the ritualised looting that was considered a legitimate reward for the victors, and the long trudge home after the fighting ended, carrying wounds that would ache for the rest of their lives and memories that would startle them awake decades later. These men had participated in an event that would be remembered for centuries, but their individual stories were lost almost immediately, absorbed into the collective narrative of national triumph that served the political and cultural needs of subsequent generations and that transformed the messy reality of medieval combat into the clean heroic lines of patriotic myth. And this transformation was inevitable and perhaps necessary, because nations require foundation stories that justify their existence and their claims to sovereignty. And Bannockburn provided Scotland with such a story at a moment when the nation desperately needed proof that independence was possible and worth the terrible cost in lives and treasure that achieving it required.